History remembers the gunshots. History remembers the assassin. History remembers that President William McKinley died because of what happened at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo. But almost nobody remembers what happened the day before. An official historical record buried among thousands of pages reveals that President McKinley unexpectedly stopped inside Puerto Rico's pavilion for coffee. Less than 24 hours later, he was mortally wounded. Today, we investigate one forgotten sentence that places Puerto Rico at the center of one of the most dramatic moments in American history. Good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday, and welcome back to another great episode of Chronicles and Cocktails. I'm Josue, and I'm bringing you history as I learn it. If this is your first time here, welcome. Every Sunday, we uncover forgotten stories, supported by historical documents, newspapers, government reports, and original research. If you enjoy history, culture, travel, and stories you've probably never heard of, you're in the right place. Last week, we explored another remarkable historical connection between Atlantic Canada and Puerto Rico. Today, we're staying in North America to investigate another connection, one that surprised even me, and one that I have been researching for about a year now. This isn't simply the story of William McKinley. It isn't the story of Buffalo. It isn't even the story of coffee. It's a story of a forgotten movement that somehow connects Puerto Rico, Buffalo, my hometown of Utuado, and the final peaceful day of an American president. At the beginning of the 20th century, international expositions were among the largest public events in the world. They were more than fairs. They were showcases of civilization. Nations displayed their industries, their culture, their agriculture, their technology, their architecture, and their ambitions. The Pan-American Exposition of 1901, held in Buffalo, New York, was designed specifically to celebrate the countries and territories of the Western Hemisphere. Its purpose was to strengthen commercial relationships, encourage cooperation, and demonstrate the astonishing technological advances that had transformed the Americas during the 19th century. Buffalo was selected because it was America's eighth largest city, connected by extensive railroads, Great Lakes shipping, and located only a short distance from Niagara Falls, whose hydroelectric power illuminated the exposition every evening. The dazzling display of hundreds of thousands of electric lights earned the exposition the nickname the Rainbow City. Imagine arriving in Buffalo in 1901. You had probably traveled for hours, perhaps days, by train. Then, suddenly, an entire city appeared illuminated by electricity for millions of visitors. It was unlike anything they had ever experienced. This wasn't simply an exhibition, it was the future put on display. More than 40 nations and territories participated, among them one of America's newest possessions, Puerto Rico. Only 3 years had passed since the Spanish-American War. The island was still recovering politically, economically, and physically, yet it was about to introduce itself to millions of Americans. Puerto Rico entered the 20th century under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The island had changed sovereignty in 1898. Huracán San Ciriaco devastated agriculture in 1899. Municipal governments struggled financially after this. Coffee plantations suffered enormous losses. Many questioned whether Puerto Rico should even participate in an international exposition, yet Governor Charles H. Allen believed otherwise. His annual report to President McKinley specifically stated that Puerto Rico would showcase its principal agricultural products. That's coffee, sugar, tobacco, before the American public. The government appropriated $10,000 for Puerto Rico's participation, a figure many contemporaries considered insufficient, especially given the island's fragile economic condition. Alright, and not everybody agreed with that decision. In fact, one of the strongest critics came from my hometown, Utuado. And what he wrote became one of the most fascinating discoveries I made while researching this documentary. In February 1901, a letter appeared in La Correspondencia de Puerto Rico. Its author, Federico Legrand, a native of Utuado. Legrand wasn't inexperienced. He made it clear he had participated in international expositions before, and because of that experience, he believed Puerto Rico should stay home. He argued that the government intended to present Puerto Rico in his memorable words as el mono de la fiesta para enseñar lo mejor de nuestra miseria. In other words, a party monkey displaying the very best of the island's misery. His criticism wasn't directed only at the exposition. It was directed at Puerto Rico's political, economical, and social reality. Only days later, the newspaper La Democracia echoed many of Legrand's concerns. Its editorial argued that, aside from sugar, coffee, tobacco, and rum, Puerto Rico had little else capable of impressing the world. I find that absolutely fascinating because history usually remembers the exposition. History remembers President McKinley. History remembers the assassination. But almost nobody remembers that one of the strongest voices opposing Puerto Rico's participation came from Utuado. Ironically, the very municipality that produced some of the finest coffee on the island. One of the questions I kept asking myself during this investigation was surprisingly simple. If President McKinley drank Puerto Rican coffee, where did that coffee come from? Unfortunately, no surviving document identifies the plantation, no report identifies the municipality, no newspaper names an hacienda, no invoice tells us where those beans originated. So, does that trail end here? Not necessarily. Historical research often requires us to distinguish between facts, reasonable historical deduction, and speculation. Facts are supported directly by documents. Speculation has no documentary foundation. Historical deduction falls somewhere in between. It begins with established evidence, then asks what conclusion must reasonably follows. And in this case, two historical facts deserve our attention. First, at the turn of the 20th century, Utuado stood among Puerto Rico's greatest coffee-producing municipalities. Its mountains contained some of the island's largest coffee haciendas. And get this, its steam-powered mills produced enormous quantities of coffee destined for export. Coffee wasn't simply grown in Utuado, it identified Utuado. And second, the Insular Commission responsible for Puerto Rico's participation in Buffalo didn't ask municipalities to bring whatever happened to be available. Its mission was to gather Puerto Rico's finest agricultural products to represent the island before millions of visitors. Coffee, sugar, tobacco, the best examples available. Those instructions appear throughout the historical record. Now, here's where we need to be careful. Can we prove with the surviving document that President McKinley's coffee specifically came from Utuado? No way, we cannot. And as historians, We should never claim otherwise. But can we reasonably conclude that coffee from Utuado almost certainly formed part of the island's collective exhibit? Given Utuado's dominant role in Puerto Rico's coffee industry, I believe yes. The conclusion follows the historical evidence, not because one document says so, but because all the documents together point us in that direction. Whether those beans originated in Utuado, Lares, Yauco, Adjuntas, Maricao, or another mountain municipality, they represented something much larger than one town. They represented Puerto Rico itself, its mountains, its farmers, its craftsmanship, its hospitality. And perhaps that is exactly what President McKinley tasted that afternoon. Puerto Rico's pavilion wasn't simply another exhibition space. It was a statement constructed on the island, taken apart, transported to Buffalo, and rebuilt there. The Puerto Rico building measured approximately 42 by 78 feet, featured a 55-foot cupola, and was built entirely from Puerto Rican woods. Visitors immediately recognized it as something different from the surrounding buildings. Inside, Puerto Rico displayed the products that defined its economy: coffee, sugar, tobacco, agricultural exhibits, manufactured goods, textiles, everything intended to introduce America's newest Caribbean possession to millions of curious visitors. Commissioners José T. Silva and Dr. José Gómez Brioso oversaw much of the island's agricultural and manufacturing exhibits. But perhaps the pavilion's greatest attraction wasn't an exhibit at all. It was hospitality. Visitors entered the building, were welcomed warmly, and received complimentary Puerto Rican coffee, often accompanied by Puerto Rican cigars. Thousands of visitors experienced Puerto Rico not through a display case, but through conversation, hospitality, and taste. Think about that for a moment. For many Americans, their very first experience with Puerto Rico wasn't reading about it. It wasn't seeing photographs. It wasn't politics. It was meeting Puerto Ricans, sharing a conversation, drinking Puerto Rican coffee, smoking a Puerto Rican cigar. That was the island's introduction to America. Ironically, while American visitors generally enjoyed the pavilion, Puerto Rican newspapers often did not. Criticism appeared almost immediately. Some visitors returning from Buffalo described the building as embarrassingly small. Others compared it to a guardhouse. One famously called it a mamarracho. The entrance, according to one critic, contained little more than 2 struggling banana plants and 2 coffee plants. Inside, visitors reportedly found very few exhibits, including a guiro that curious Americans kept trying to play by blowing into it like a flute. That little story always makes me smile. Not because the criticism was funny, but because it reminds us how unfamiliar Puerto Rico still was to most Americans. Imagine seeing a guiro, having absolutely no idea what it is, and deciding the logical thing to do is blow into it. Everything inside that building represented someone's first encounter with Puerto Rico. And somewhere inside that building, among the coffee, the cigars, the commissioners, and the visitors, history was quietly waiting. Because in early September, the President of the United States of America would unexpectedly walk through those doors. By early September, the Pan-American Exposition had already welcomed millions of visitors. President William McKinley had intended to attend months earlier, but because of First Lady Ida McKinley's health, the visit had been postponed. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt officially opened the exposition instead. Now, on September 5, the president had finally arrived. Crossing the triumphal causeway, President McKinley entered the exposition grounds surrounded by soldiers, bands, officials, and enormous crowds. He delivered what historians now consider one of the most important speeches of his presidency, speaking about trade, commerce, and cooperation among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. He outlined a vision of closer economic relationships throughout the Americas. Ironically, it would become his final major public address. Think about the symbolism. Moments after delivering a speech promoting commerce throughout the Americas, the president begins touring exhibits representing those very nations. One of those stops was completely unplanned, and it happened inside Puerto Rico's pavilion. The official record tells us that after his speech, President McKinley toured the exposition. He complimented exhibits, met commissioners, visited pavilions. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. Then, almost hidden inside the official account, appears a sentence that changes everything. It reads, "Afterwards, he toured the exhibits complimenting all. He had an unscheduled coffee at the Puerto Rican Building with the Latin American commissioners." One sentence, that's all. No elaborate descriptions, no lengthy newspaper article, no photograph. Just one sentence. Yet that sentence forever places Puerto Rico inside one of the most consequential presidential stories in American history. Think about everything we've learned. A pavilion criticized back home, coffee criticized by newspapers, and exhibit many Puerto Ricans considered disappointing. Yet, when the president toured the exposition, he stopped there not because protocol required it. The historical record specifically says the visit was on schedule. And that's one of the reasons I find this story so compelling. History isn't always made by carefully planned ceremonies. Sometimes, history happens because someone unexpectedly accepts an invitation to sit down, share a conversation, and enjoy a cup of coffee. Unfortunately, history leaves us wanting more. It doesn't tell us where President McKinley sat. It doesn't record the conversation. It doesn't preserve a menu or a photograph or even who actually poured the coffee. What it gives us is something historians value just as much: evidence. We know the Puerto Rico building functioned as far more than an exhibit. It became a place of hospitality. Visitors entered, asked questions, learned about Puerto Rico, received cigars, and enjoyed complimentary Puerto Rican coffee. It was one of the few places inside the exposition where visitors experienced Puerto Rico, not only visually, but personally, through conversation, through taste, through hospitality. No historian can tell us what President McKinley thought about the coffee. No document records his opinion, but we do know he chose to stop. The visit wasn't scheduled. No protocol required it. Somewhere during his tour, someone invited the president inside. He accepted. And history quietly recorded one unforgettable sentence. That sentence is why this documentary exists. Normally, this is where we make a cocktail, right? But today, I don't think a cocktail belongs in this story. Instead, let's make something far more appropriate. A simple cup of Puerto Rican coffee. I don't think that leaving you without a cocktail would be appropriate. And this is because at the 1901 Pan-American Exposition held in Buffalo, Ron del Barrilito was officially awarded and recognized as one of the best rums in the world, marking its first major international milestone. This historic participation consolidated the brand's reputation outside of Puerto Rico and left a permanent mark on its visual identity. Now, if you look closely at a current bottle of Ron del Barrilito, you will see this historic moment reflected. The gold seals, the upper section of its iconic label features replicas of the original medals and seals won in international competitions. So I thought, what best cocktail to use than the café con ron? Well, first of all, because we know coffee was served in the 1901 Pan-American Exhibition. And because we know for sure that rum, and especially Ron del Barrilito, was there also. So this is simple to make. You're going to be shaking together 3 ounces of cold brew coffee, 2 ounces of local rum. Well, in this case, it should be Ron del Barrilito, and have an ounce of coffee liqueur. You're also going to use a little bit of vanilla to taste, and brown sugar syrup, and a pinch of salt. Shake all that, like I mentioned, and then strain it over an ice cube. It could be a big round or square ice cube, or just regular ice. So, after everything that we've seen, what can we honestly conclude? As historians, our responsibility isn't to exaggerate, our responsibility is to follow the evidence. The historical record allows us to state several things with confidence. President William McKinley visited the Puerto Rico building. The visit was unscheduled. He met with the Latin American commissioners. He accepted coffee. Those are documented. What history does not tell us is whether he drank another cup of coffee later that evening or early the following morning. No surviving source answered that question. That's why the title of this episode is intentionally phrased the way it is: McKinley's Last Coffee. Not because we can prove beyond doubt that it was literally the final cup he ever drank, but because it is the last documented cup of coffee recorded in the historical record. Sometimes history leaves us with certainty. Sometimes it leaves us with probability. Knowing the difference is what makes good history. One forgotten sentence, hidden inside an official historical account, allows us to connect an American president, Puerto Rican hospitality, buffalo, coffee, and the mountain farms of an island that had only recently entered the American story. Perhaps the coffee came from Utuado. Perhaps it came from another mountain municipality. We cannot know for certain, but we do know this. When President William McKinley accepted that invitation, he wasn't simply drinking coffee. He was experiencing one of Puerto Rico's greatest symbols, offered with generosity, inside a pavilion built to introduce an island to the American people. History remembers the loudest moments, the explosions, the speeches, the assassinations, But sometimes, history quietly survives inside a newspaper advertisement, inside an official report, inside a forgotten photograph, or inside a simple cup of coffee. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this story teaches us. Not every important moment announces itself. Sometimes history simply invites you inside, offers you a chair, pours you a cup of coffee, and only later do you realize you were witnessing history. So, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Chronicles and Cocktails. If you enjoyed today's documentary, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave me a comment below. Had you ever heard about President McKinley's visit to the Puerto Rico building? And do you think this was in fact his last documented cup of coffee? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like to support documentaries like this one, consider becoming a channel member or sending a super thanks. Your support helps fund the travel and the archival research and the original investigations that make episodes like this possible. Until next Sunday, be good, have fun, read a lot, get smart, travel, go to church, and of course, salud.